Now reading The Monk, a romance by M.G. Matthew Gregory, Lewis, a public domain text. Chapter 5. O you, whom vanity's light bark conveys on fame's mad voyage by the wind of praise, with what a shifting gale your course you ply, forever sunk too low, or borne too high, who pants for glory finds but short repose, a breath revives him, and a breath o'erthrows. Pope. Here the Marquis concluded his adventures. Lorenzo, before he could determine on his reply, passed some moments in reflection. At length he broke silence. "Raymond," said he, taking his hand, "strict honour would oblige me to wash off in your blood the stain thrown upon my family, but the circumstances of your case forbid me to consider you as an enemy. The temptation was too great to be resisted. 'Tis the superstition of my relations which has occasioned these misfortunes, and they are more the offenders than yourself and Agnes. What has passed between you cannot be recalled, but may yet be repaired by uniting you to my sister. You have ever been, you still continue to be, my dearest and indeed my only friend. I feel for Agnes the truest affection, and there is no one on whom I would bestow her more willingly than on yourself. Pursue then your design. I will accompany you tomorrow night, and conduct her myself to the house of the cardinal. My presence will be a sanction for her conduct, and prevent her incurring blame by her flight from the convent." The Marquis thanked him in terms by no means deficient in gratitude. Lorenzo then informed him that he had nothing more to apprehend from Donna Rodolpha's enmity. 5 months had already elapsed since, in an excess of passion, she broke a blood vessel and expired in the course of a few hours. He then proceeded to mention the interests of Antonia. The Marquis was much surprised at hearing of this new relation. His father had carried his hatred of Elvira to the grave, and had never given the least hint that he knew what was become of his eldest son's widow. Don Raymond assured his friend that he was not mistaken in supposing him ready to acknowledge his sister-in-law and her amiable daughter. The preparations for the elopement would not permit his visiting them the next day, but in the meanwhile he desired Lorenzo to assure them of his friendship, and to supply Elvira upon his account with any sums which she might want. This the youth promised to do, as soon as her abode should be known to him. He then took leave of his future brother, and returned to the Palace de Medina. The day was already on the point of breaking when the Marquis retired to his chamber. Conscious that his narrative would take up some hours, and wishing to secure himself from interruption on returning to the hotel, he ordered his attendants not to sit up for him. Consequently, he was somewhat surprised on entering his anteroom to find Theodore established there. The page sat near a table with a pen in his hand, and was so totally occupied by his employment that he perceived not his lord's approach. The Marquis stopped to observe him. Theodore wrote a few lines, then paused, and scratched out a part of the writing, then wrote again, smiled, and seemed highly pleased with what he had been about. At last he threw down his pen, sprang from his chair, and clapped his hands together joyfully. "There it is," cried he aloud. "Now they are charming." His transports were interrupted by a laugh from the Marquis, who suspected the nature of his employment. "What is so charming, Theodore?" The youth started, and looked round. He blushed, ran to the table, seized the paper on which he had been writing, and concealed it in confusion. "Oh, my lord, I knew not that you were so near me. Can I be of use to you? Lucas is already gone to bed. I shall follow his example when I have given my opinion of your verses." "My verses, my lord?" "Nay, I am sure that you have been writing some, for nothing else could have kept you awake till this time of the morning. Where are they, Theodore?" "I shall like to see your composition." Theodore's cheeks glowed with still deeper crimson. He longed to show his poetry, but first chose to be pressed for it. "Indeed, my lord, they are not worthy your attention." "Not these verses, which you just now declared to be so charming." "Come, come, let me see whether our opinions are the same." "I promise that you shall find in me an indulgent critic." The boy produced his paper with seeming reluctance, but the satisfaction which sparkled in his dark expressive eyes betrayed the vanity of his little bosom. The Marquis smiled, while he observed the emotions of an heart as yet but little skilled in veiling its sentiments. He seated himself upon a sofa. Theodore, while hope and fear contended on his anxious countenance, waited with inquietude for his master's decision, while the Marquis read the following lines. "Love, Andage. The night was dark, the wind blew cold, Anacreon, grown morose and old, sat by his fire and fed the cheerful flame. Suddenly the cottage door expands, and lo! Before him Cupid stands, casts round a friendly glance, and greets him by his name. What What is it thou? The startled sire in sullen tone exclaimed, while ire with crimson flushed his pale and wrinkled cheek. Wouldst thou again with amorous rage inflame my bosom? Steeled by age, vain boy, to pierce my breast, thine arrows are too weak. What seek you in this desert drear? No smiles or sports inhabit here. Ne'er did these valleys witness dalliance sweet, eternal winter binds the plains. Age in my house despotic reigns, my garden boasts no flower, my bosom boasts no heat. Begone, and seek the blooming bower, where some ripe virgin courts thy power, or bid provoking dreams flit round her bed, on Damon's amorous breast repose, wanton, on Chloe's lip of rose, or make her blushing cheek a pillow for thy head. Be such thy haunts these regions cold avoid, nor think grown wise and old this hoary head again. Thy yoke shall bear, remembering that my fairest years by thee were marked with sighs and tears. I think thy friendship false, and shun the guileful snare. I have not yet forgot the pains I felt, while bound in Julia's chains, the ardent flames with which my bosom burned, the nights I passed deprived of rest, the jealous pangs which racked my breast, my disappointed hopes, and passion unreturned. Then fly, and curse mine eyes no more. Fly from my peaceful cottage door. No day, no hour, no moment shalt thou stay. I know thy falsehood, scorn thy arts, distrust thy smiles, and fear thy darts, traitor, begone, and seek some other to betray. Does age, old man, your wits confound? Replied the offended god, and frowned. His frown was sweet, as is the virgin's smile. Do you to me these words address? To me, who do not love you less, though you my friendship scorn, and pleasures past revile. If one proud fair you chance to find, 100 other nymphs were kind, whose smiles might well for Julia's frowns atone, but such is man. His partial hand unnumbered favours writes on sand, but stamps one little fault on solid lasting stone. Ingrate, who led thee to the wave, at noon where Lesbia loved to lave, who named the bower alone where Daphne lay, and who, when Calais shrieked for aid, bade you with kisses hush the maid? What other wasn't the love, oh, false Anacreon, say, then you could call me gentle boy, my only bliss, my source of joy. Then you could prize me dearer than your soul, could kiss, and dance me on your knees, and swear not wine itself would please, had not the lip of love first touched the flowing bowl. Must those sweet days return no more? Must I for aye your loss deplore, banished your heart, and from your favour driven? Ah, we are. No, my fears that smile denies, that heaving breast, those sparkling eyes declare me ever dear, and all my faults forgiven. Again beloved, esteemed, carest Cupid, shall in thine arms be pressed, sport on thy knees, or on thy bosom sleep, my torch thine age. Struck heart shall warm, my hand pale winter's rage disarm, and youth and spring shall here once more their revels keep. A feather now of golden hue, he smiling from his pinion drew. This to the poet's hand the boy commits, and straight before Anacreon's eyes the fairest dreams of fancy rise, and round his favoured head wild inspiration flits. His bosom glows with amorous fire, eager he grasps the magic lyre. Swift o'er the tuneful chords his fingers move, the feather plucked from Cupid's wing sweeps the too long neglected string, while soft Anacreon sings the power and praise of love. Soon as that name was heard, the woods shook off their snows, the melting floods broke their cold chains, and winter fled away. Once more the earth was decked with flowers, mild zephyrs breathed through blooming bowers, high towered the glorious sun, and poured the blaze of day. Attracted by the harmonious sound, sylvans and fauns the cot surround, and curious crowd the minstrel to behold. The wood-nymphs haste the spell to prove, eager they run, they list, they love, and while they hear the strain, forget the man is old. Cupid, to nothing constant long, perched on the harp attends the song, or stifles with a kiss the dulcet notes, now on the poet's breast reposes, now twines his hoary locks with roses, or borne on wings of gold in wanton circle floats. Then thus Anacreon, I no more at other shrine my vows will pour, since Cupid deigns my numbers to inspire, from Phoebus or the blue-eyed maid, now shall my verse request no aid, for love alone shall be the patron of my lyre. In lofty strain of earlier days, I spread the king's or hero's praise, and struck the martial chords with epic fire, but farewell, hero. Farewell, king. your deeds my lips no more shall sing, for love alone shall be the subject of my lyre." The Marquis returned the paper with a smile of encouragement. "Your little poem pleases me much," said he. "However, you must not count my opinion for anything. I am no judge of verses, and for my own part never composed more than 6 lines in my life, those 6 produced so unlucky an effect that I am fully resolved never to compose another. But I wander from my subject. I was going to say that you cannot employ your time worse than in making verses. An author, whether good or bad, or between both, is an animal whom everybody is privileged to attack, for though all are not able to write books, all conceive themselves able to judge them. A bad composition carries with it its own punishment, contempt, and ridicule. A good one excites envy, and entails upon its author 1,000 mortifications. He finds himself assailed by partial and ill-humoured criticism. One man finds fault with the plan, another with the style, a third with the precept, which it strives to inculcate. And they who cannot succeed in finding fault with the book employ themselves in stigmatizing its author. They maliciously rake out from obscurity every little circumstance which may throw ridicule upon his private character or conduct, and aim at wounding the man, since they cannot hurt the writer. In short, to enter the lists of literature is wilfully to expose yourself to the arrows of neglect, ridicule, envy, and disappointment. Whether you write well or ill, be assured that you will not escape from blame. Indeed, this circumstance contains a young author's chief consolation. He remembers that Lope de Vega and Calderona had unjust and envious critics, and he modestly conceives himself to be exactly in their predicament. But I am conscious that all these sage observations are thrown away upon you. Authorship is a mania to conquer, which no reasons are sufficiently strong, and you might as easily persuade me not to love, as I persuade you not to write. However, if you cannot help being occasionally seized with a poetical paroxysm, take at least the precaution of communicating your verses to none but those whose partiality for you secures their approbation." "Then, my lord, you do not think these lines tolerable?" said Theodore with an humble and dejected air. "You mistake my meaning. As I said before, they have pleased me much, but my regard for you makes me partial, and others might judge them less favourably. I must still remark that even my prejudice in your favour does not blind me so much as to prevent my observing several faults. For instance, you make a terrible confusion of metaphors. You are too apt to make the strength of your lines consist more in the words than sense. Some of the verses only seem introduced in order to rhyme with others, and most of the best ideas are borrowed from other poets, though possibly you are unconscious of the theft yourself. These faults may occasionally be excused in a work of length, but a short poem must be correct and perfect. All this is true, Señor, but you should consider that I only write for pleasure. Your defects are the less excusable. Their incorrectness may be forgiven in those who work for money, who are obliged to complete a given task in a given time, and are paid according to the bulk, not value of their productions. But in those whom no necessity forces to turn author, who merely write for fame and have full leisure to polish their compositions, faults are unpardonable and merit the sharpest arrows of criticism." The Marquis rose from the sofa. The page looked discouraged and melancholy, and this did not escape his master's observation. "However," added he smiling, "I think that these lines do you no discredit. Your versification is tolerably easy, and your ear seems to be just. The perusal of your little poem upon the whole gave me much pleasure, and if it is not asking too great a favour, I shall be highly obliged to you for a copy." The youth's countenance immediately cleared up. He perceived not the smile, half approving, half ironical, which accompanied the request, and he promised the copy with great readiness. The Marquis withdrew to his chamber, much amused by the instantaneous effect produced upon Theodore's vanity by the conclusion of his criticism. He threw himself upon his couch, sleep soon stole over him, and his dreams presented him with the most flattering pictures of happiness with Agnes. On reaching the Hotel de Medina, Lorenzo's first care was to inquire for letters. He found several waiting for him, but that which he sought was not amongst them. Lenella had found it impossible to write that evening. However, her impatience to secure Don Cristoval's heart, on which she flattered herself with having made no slight impression, permitted her not to pass another day without informing him where she was to be found. On her return from the Capuchin church, she had related to her sister, with exultation, how attentive and handsome Cavalier had been to her, as also how his companion had undertaken to plead Antonia's cause with the Marquis de las Cisternas. Elvira received this intelligence with sensations very different from those with which it was communicated. She blamed her sister's imprudence in confiding her history to an absolute stranger and expressed her fears lest this inconsiderate step should prejudice the Marquis against her. The greatest of her apprehensions she concealed in her own breast. She had observed with inquietude that at the mention of Lorenzo a deep blush spread itself over her daughter's cheek. The timid Antonia dared not to pronounce his name. Without knowing wherefore, she felt embarrassed when he was made the subject of discourse, and endeavoured to change the conversation to Ambrosio. Elvira perceived the emotions of this young bosom. In consequence, she insisted upon Lianella's breaking her promise to the cavaliers. A sigh, which on hearing this order escaped from Antonia, confirmed the wary mother in her resolution. Through this resolution, Leonela was determined to break. She conceived it to be inspired by envy, and that her sister dreaded her being elevated above her. Without imparting her design to anyone, she took an opportunity of dispatching the following note to Lorenzo. It was delivered to him as soon as he woke. Doubtless, Señor Don Lorenzo, you have frequently accused me of ingratitude and forgetfulness, but on the word of a virgin, it was out of my power to perform my promise yesterday. I know not in what words to inform you how strange a reception my sister gave your kind wish to visit her. She is an odd woman, with many good points about her, but her jealousy of me frequently makes her conceive notions quite unaccountable. On hearing that your friend had paid some little attention to me, she immediately took the alarm. She blamed my conduct, and has absolutely forbidden me to let you know our abode. My strong sense of gratitude for your kind offers of service, and, shall I confess it, my desire to behold once more the too amiable Don Cristoval will not permit my obeying her injunctions. I have therefore stolen a moment to inform you that we lodge in the Strada di Saniago, 4 doors from the Palace d'Albornoz, and nearly opposite to the barber's Miguel Coelho. Inquire for Donna Elvira d'Alfa, since, in compliance with her father-in-law's order, my sister continues to be called by her maiden name. At 8 this evening you will be sure of finding us, but let not a word drop which may raise a suspicion of my having written this letter. Should you see the Conde d'Osorio, tell him, I blush while I declare it, tell him that his presence will be but too acceptable to the sympathetic Leonela. The latter sentences were written in red ink to express the blushes of her cheek, while she committed an outrage upon her virgin modesty. Lorenzo had no sooner perused this note than he set out in search of Don Cristoval. Not being able to find him in the course of the day, he proceeded to Donna Elvira's alone, to Leonela's infinite disappointment. The domestic by whom he sent up his name, having already declared his lady to be at home, she had no excuse for refusing his visit, yet she consented to receive it with much reluctance. That reluctance was increased by the changes which his approach produced in Antonia's countenance, nor was it by any means abated when the youth himself appeared. The symmetry of his person, animation of his features, and natural elegance of his manners and address convinced Elvira that such a guest must be dangerous for her daughter. She resolved to treat him with distant politeness, to decline his services with gratitude for the tender of them, and to make him feel, without offence, that his future visits would be far from acceptable. On his entrance he found Elvira, who was indisposed, reclining upon a sofa. Antonia sat by her embroidery frame, and Leonela, in a pastoral dress, held Montimayor's Diana. In spite of her being the mother of Antonia, Lorenzo could not help expecting to find in Elvira Leonela's true sister, and the daughter of as honest a painstaking shoemaker as any in Cordova. A single glance was sufficient to undeceive him. He beheld a woman whose features, though impaired by time and sorrow, still bore the marks of distinguished beauty. A serious dignity reigned upon her countenance, but was tempered by a grace and sweetness which rendered her truly enchanting. Lorenzo fancied that she must have resembled her daughter in her youth, and readily excused the imprudence of the late Conde de las Cisternas. She desired him to be seated, and immediately resumed her place upon the sofa. Antonia received him with a simple reverence, and continued her work. Her cheeks were suffused with crimson, and she strove to conceal her emotion by leaning over her embroidery frame. Her aunt also chose to play off her airs of modesty. She affected to blush and tremble, and waited with her eyes cast down to receive, as she expected, the compliments of Don Cristoval. Finding after some time that no sign of his approach was given, she ventured to look round the room, and perceived with vexation that Medina was unaccompanied. Impatience would not permit her waiting for an explanation. Interrupting Lorenzo, who was delivering Raymond's message, she desired to know what was become of his friend. He, who thought it necessary to maintain himself in her good graces, strove to console her under her disappointment by committing a little violence upon truth. "Ah, Senora," he replied in a melancholy voice, "how grieved will he be at losing this opportunity of paying you his respects. A relation's illness has obliged him to quit Madrid in haste, but on his return he will doubtless seize the first moment with transport to throw himself at your feet." As he said this, his eyes met those of Elvira. She punished his falsehood sufficiently by darting at him a look expressive of displeasure and reproach. Neither did the deceit answer his intention. Vexed and disappointed, Leonela rose from her seat and retired in dudgeon to her own apartment. Lorenzo hastened to repair the fault which had injured him in Elvira's opinion. He related his conversation with the Marquis respecting her. He assured her that Raymond was prepared to acknowledge her for his brother's widow, and that till it was in his power to pay his compliments to her in person, Lorenzo was commissioned to supply his place. This intelligence relieved Elvira from a heavy weight of uneasiness. She had now found a protector for the fatherless Antonia, for whose future fortunes she had suffered the greatest apprehensions. She was not sparing of her thanks to him who had interfered so generously in her behalf, but still she gave him no invitation to repeat his visit. However, when upon rising to depart he requested permission to inquire after her health occasionally, the polite earnestness of his manner, gratitude for his services, and respect for his friend the Marquis would not admit of a refusal. She consented reluctantly to receive him. He promised not to abuse her goodness and quitted the house. Antonia was now left alone with her mother. A temporary silence ensued. Both wished to speak upon the same subject, but neither knew how to introduce it. The one felt a bashfulness which sealed up her lips, and for which she could not account. The other feared to find her apprehensions true, or to inspire her daughter with notions to which she might be still a stranger. At length Elvira began the conversation. "That is a charming young man, Antonia. I am much pleased with him. Was he long near you yesterday in the cathedral?" "He quitted me not for a moment while I stayed in the church. He gave me his seat, and was very obliging and attentive." "Indeed? Why then have you never mentioned his name to me? Your aunt launched out in praise of his friend, and you vaunted Ambrosio's eloquence, but neither said a word of Don Lorenzo's person and accomplishments. Had not Leonela spoken of his readiness to undertake our cause, I should not have known him to be in existence." She paused. Antonia coloured, but was silent. "Perhaps you judge him less favourably than I do. In my opinion, his figure is pleasing, his conversation sensible, and manners engaging. Still, he may have struck you differently. You may think him disagreeable and—" "Disagreeable? Oh, dear mother, how should I possibly think him so? I should be very ungrateful were I not sensible of his kindness yesterday, and very blind if his merits had escaped me. His figure is so graceful, so noble, his manners so gentle yet so manly. I never yet saw so many accomplishments united in one person, and I doubt whether Madrid can produce his equal." "Why then were you so silent in praise of this phoenix of Madrid? Why was it concealed from me that his society had afforded you pleasure?" "In truth, I know not. You asked me a question which I cannot resolve myself. I was on the point of mentioning him 1,000 times. His name was constantly upon my lips, but when I would have pronounced it, I wanted courage to execute my design. However, if I did not speak of him, it was not that I thought of him the less. That I believe, but shall I tell you why you wanted courage? It was because, accustomed to confide to me your most secret thoughts, you knew not how to conceal, yet feared to acknowledge, that your heart nourished a sentiment which you were conscious I should disapprove. Come hither to me, my child." Antonia quitted her embroidery frame, threw herself upon her knees by the sofa, and hid her face in her mother's lap. "Fear not, my sweet girl. Consider me equally as your friend and parent, and apprehend no reproof from me. I have read the emotions of your bosom. You are yet ill-skilled in concealing them, and they could not escape my attentive eye. This Lorenzo is dangerous to your repose. He has already made an impression upon your heart. 'Tis true that I perceive easily that your affection is returned, but what can be the consequences of this attachment? You are poor and friendless, my Antonia. Lorenzo is the heir of the Duke of Medina Celi. Even should himself mean honourably, his uncle never will consent to your union, nor without that uncle's consent will I. By sad experience I know what sorrows she must endure, who marries into a family unwilling to receive her. Then struggle with your affection, whatever pains it may cost you, strive to conquer it. Your heart is tender and susceptible, it has already received a strong impression. But when once convinced that you should not encourage such sentiments, I trust that you have sufficient fortitude to drive them from your bosom." Antonia kissed her hand and promised implicit obedience. Elvira then continued, To prevent your passion from growing stronger, it will be needful to prohibit Lorenzo's visits. The service which he has rendered me permits not my forbidding them positively, but unless I judge too favourably of his character, he will discontinue them without taking offence, if I confess to him my reasons and throw myself entirely on his generosity. The next time that I see him, I will honestly avow to him the embarrassment which his presence occasions. How say you, my child, is not this measure necessary?" Antonia subscribed to everything without hesitation, though not without regret. Her mother kissed her affectionately and retired to bed. Antonia followed her example and vowed so frequently never more to think of Lorenzo that till sleep closed her eyes she thought of nothing else. While this was passing at Elvira's, Lorenzo hastened to rejoin the Marquis. Everything was ready for the second elopement of Agnes, and at 12 the two friends with a coach and 4 were at the garden wall of the convent. Don Raymond drew out his key and unlocked the door. They entered and waited for some time in expectation of being joined by Agnes. At length the Marquis grew impatient. Beginning to fear that his second attempt would succeed no better than the first, he proposed to reconnoitre the convent. The friends advanced towards it. Everything was still and dark. The prioress was anxious to keep the story a secret, fearing lest the crime of one of its members should bring disgrace upon the whole community, or that the interposition of powerful relations should deprive her vengeance of its intended victim. She took care, therefore, to give the lover of Agnes no cause to suppose that his design was discovered, and his mistress on the point of suffering the punishment of her fault. The same reason made her reject the idea of arresting the unknown seducer in the garden. Such a proceeding would have created much disturbance, and the disgrace of her convent would have been noised about Madrid. She contented herself with confining Agnes closely. As to the lover, she left him at liberty to pursue his designs. What she had expected was the result. The Marquis and Lorenzo waited in vain till the break of day. They then retired without noise, alarmed at the failure of their plan, and ignorant of the cause of its ill success. The next morning, Lorenzo went to the convent and requested to see his sister. The prioress appeared at the grate with a melancholy countenance. She informed him that for several days Agnes had appeared much agitated, that she had been pressed by the nuns in vain to reveal the cause and apply to their tenderness for advice and consolation, that she had obstinately persisted in concealing the cause of her distress, but that on Thursday evening it had produced so violent an effect upon her constitution that she had fallen ill, and was actually confined to her bed. Lorenzo did not credit a syllable of this account. He insisted upon seeing his sister. If she was unable to come to the grate, he desired to be admitted to her cell. The prioress crossed herself. She was shocked at the very idea of a man's profane eye pervading the interior of her holy mansion, and professed herself astonished that Lorenzo could think of such a thing. She told him that his request could not be granted, but that if he returned the next day, she hoped that her beloved daughter would then be sufficiently recovered to join him at the parlour grate. With this answer, Lorenzo was obliged to retire, unsatisfied and trembling for his sister's safety. He returned the next morning at an early hour. Agnes was worse. The physician had pronounced her to be in imminent danger. She was ordered to remain quiet, and it was utterly impossible for her to receive her brother's visit. Lorenzo stormed at this answer, but there was no resource. He raved, he entreated, he threatened. No means were left untried to obtain a sight of Agnes. His endeavours were as fruitless as those of the day before, and he returned in despair to the Marquis. On his side, the latter had spared no pains to discover what had occasioned his plot to fail. Don Cristoval, to whom the affair was now entrusted, endeavoured to worm out the secret from the old portress of St. Clair, with whom he had formed an acquaintance. But she was too much upon her guard, and he gained from her no intelligence. The Marquis was almost distracted, and Lorenzo felt scarcely less inquietude. Both were convinced that the purposed elopement must have been discovered. They doubted not, but the malady of Agnes was a pretence, but they knew not by what means to rescue her from the hands of the prioress. Regularly every day did Lorenzo visit the convent. As regularly was he informed that his sister rather grew worse than better. Certain that her indisposition was feigned, these accounts did not alarm him, but his ignorance of her fate and of the motives which induced the prioress to keep her from him excited the most serious uneasiness. He was still uncertain what steps he ought to take when the Marquis received a letter from the Cardinal Duke of Lerma. It enclosed the Pope's expected bull, ordering that Agnes should be released from her vows and restored to her relations. This essential paper decided at once the proceedings of her friends. They resolved that Lorenzo should carry it to the Domina without delay, and demand that his sister should be instantly given up to him. Against this mandate illness could not be pleaded. It gave her brother the power of removing her instantly to the Palace de Medina, and he determined to use that power on the following day. His mind relieved from inquietude respecting his sister, and his spirits raised by the hope of soon restoring her to freedom, he now had time to give a few moments to love and to Antonia. At the same hour as on his former visit he repaired to Donna Elvira's, she had given orders for his admission. As soon as he was announced, her daughter retired with Lanella, and when he entered the chamber, he found the lady of the house alone. She received him with less distance than before, and desired him to place himself near her upon the sofa. She then, without losing time, opened her business, as had been agreed between herself and Antonia. "You must not think me ungrateful, Don Lorenzo, or forgetful how essential are the services which you have rendered me with the Marquis. I feel the weight of my obligations. Nothing under the sun should induce my taking the step to which I am now compelled, but the interest of my child, of my beloved Antonia. My health is declining. God only knows how soon I may be summoned before his throne. My daughter will be left without parents, and should she lose the protection of the Cisternas family, without friends. She is young and artless, uninstructed in the world's perfidy, and with charms sufficient to render her an object of seduction. Judge, then, how I must tremble at the prospect before her. Judge how anxious I must be to keep her from their society, who may excite the yet dormant passions of her bosom. You are amiable, Don Lorenzo. Antonia has a susceptible, a loving heart, and is grateful for the favours conferred upon us by your interference with the Marquis. Your presence makes me tremble. I fear lest it should inspire her with sentiments which may embitter the remainder of her life, or encourage her to cherish hopes in her situation unjustifiable and futile. Pardon me when I avow my terrors, and let my frankness plead in my excuse. I cannot forbid you my house, for gratitude restrains me. I can only throw myself upon your generosity, and entreat you to spare the feelings of an anxious, of a doting mother. Believe me when I assure you that I lament the necessity of rejecting your acquaintance, but there is no remedy, and Antonia's interest obliges me to beg you to forbear your visits. By complying with my request, you will increase the esteem which I already feel for you, and of which everything convinces me that you are truly deserving." "Your frankness charms me," replied Lorenzo. "You shall find that in your favourable opinion of me you were not deceived, yet I hope that the reasons, now in my power to allege, will persuade you to withdraw a request which I cannot obey without infinite reluctance. I love your daughter, love her most sincerely. I wish for no greater happiness than to inspire her with the same sentiments, and receive her hand at the altar as her husband. 'Tis true, I am not rich myself. My father's death has left me but little in my own possession, but my expectations justify my pretending to the Conde de las Cisternas' daughter." He was proceeding, but Elvira interrupted him. "Don Lorenzo, you forget in that pompous title the meanness of my origin. You forget that I have now passed 14 years in Spain, disavowed by my husband's family, and existing upon a stipend barely sufficient for the support and education of my daughter. Nay, I have even been neglected by most of my own relations, who out of envy affect to doubt the reality of my marriage. My allowance being discontinued at my father-in-law's death, I was reduced to the very brink of want. In this situation I was found by my sister, who amongst all her foibles possesses a warm, generous, and affectionate heart. She aided me with the little fortune which my father left her, persuaded me to visit Madrid, and has supported my child and myself since our quitting Murcia. Then consider not Antonia as descended from the Conde de las Cisternas. Consider her as a poor and unprotected orphan, as the grandchild of the tradesman Toribio d'Alfa, as the needy pensioner of that tradesman's daughter. Reflect upon the difference between such a situation and that of the nephew and heir of the potent Duke of Medina. I believe your intentions to be honourable, but as there are no hopes that your uncle will approve of the union, I foresee that the consequences of your attachment must be fatal to my child's repose. Pardon me, Signora, you are misinformed if you suppose the Duke of Medina to resemble the generality of men. His sentiments are liberal and disinterested. He loves me well, and I have no reason to dread his forbidding the marriage when he perceives that my happiness depends upon Antonia. But supposing him to refuse his sanction, what have I still to fear? My parents are no more, my little fortune is in my own possession, it will be sufficient to support Antonia, and I shall exchange for her hand Medina's dukedom without one sigh of regret. You are young and eager, it is natural for you to entertain such ideas, but experience has taught me to my cost that curses accompany an unequal alliance. I married the Conde de las Cisternas in opposition to the will of his relations. Many an heart-pang has punished me for the imprudent step. Wherever we bent our course, a father's execration pursued Gonzalvo. Poverty overtook us, and no friend was near to relieve our wants. Still our mutual affection existed, but alas, not without interruption. Accustomed to wealth and ease, ill could my husband support the transition to distress and indigence. He looked back with repining to the comforts which he once enjoyed. He regretted the situation which for my sake he had quitted, and in moments when despair possessed his mind, has reproached me with having made him the companion of want and wretchedness. He has called me his bane, the source of his sorrows, the cause of his destruction. Ah, God, he little knew how much keener were my own heart's reproaches. He was ignorant that I suffered trebly, for myself, for my children, and for him. 'Tis true that his anger seldom lasted long. His sincere affection for me soon revived in his heart, and then his repentance for the tears which he had made me shed tortured me even more than his reproaches. He would throw himself on the ground, implore my forgiveness in the most frantic terms, and load himself with curses for being the murderer of my repose. Taught by experience that an union contracted against the inclinations of families on either side must be unfortunate, I will save my daughter from those miseries which I have suffered. Without your uncle's consent, while I live, she never shall be yours. Undoubtedly he will disapprove of the union, his power is immense, and Antonia shall not be exposed to his anger and persecution. His persecution? How easily may that be avoided? Let the worst happen, it is but quitting Spain. My wealth may easily be realized. The Indian Islands will offer us a secure retreat. I have an estate, though not of value, in Hispaniola. Thither will we fly, and I shall consider it to be my native country, if it gives me Antonia's undisturbed possession. Ah, youth, this is a fond romantic vision. Gonzalvo thought the same. He fancied that he could leave Spain without regret, but the moment of parting undeceived him. You know not yet what it is to quit your native land, to quit it, never to behold it more. You know not what it is to exchange the scenes where you have passed your infancy for unknown realms and barbarous climates. To be forgotten, utterly eternally forgotten, by the companions of your youth. To see your dearest friends, the fondest objects of your affection, perishing with diseases incidental to Indian atmospheres, and find yourself unable to procure for them necessary assistance. I have felt all this. My husband and 2 sweet babes found their graves in Cuba. Nothing would have saved my young Antonia but my sudden return to Spain. Ah, Don Lorenzo, could you conceive what I suffered during my absence? Could you know how sorely I regretted all that I left behind, and how dear to me was the very name of Spain? I envied the winds which blew towards it, and when the Spanish sailor chaunted some well-known air as he passed my window, tears filled my eyes while I thought upon my native land. Gonzalvo too, my husband. Elvira paused, her voice faltered, and she concealed her face with her handkerchief. After a short silence, she rose from the sofa and proceeded. Excuse my quitting you for a few moments. The remembrance of what I have suffered has much agitated me, and I need to be alone. Till I return, peruse these lines. After my husband's death, I found them among his papers. Had I known sooner that he entertained such sentiments, grief would have killed me. He wrote these verses on his voyage to Cuba, when his mind was clouded by sorrow, and he forgot that he had a wife and children. What we are losing ever seems to us the most precious. Gonzalvo was quitting Spain forever, and therefore was Spain dearer to his eyes than all else which the world contained. Read them, Don Lorenzo. They will give you some idea of the feelings of a banished man. Elvira put a paper into Lorenzo's hand, and retired from the chamber. The youth examined the contents, and found them to be as follows. The exile, farewell, O native Spain, farewell for ever. These banished eyes shall view thy coasts no more. A mournful presage tells my heart that never Gonzalvo's steps again shall press thy shore. Hushed are the winds, while soft the vessel sailing with gentle motion ploughs the unruffled main. I feel my bosom's boasted courage failing, and curse the waves which bear me far from Spain. I see it yet. Beneath yon blue clear heaven still do the spires, so well beloved, appear from yonder craggy point. The gale of even still wafts my native accents to mine ear, propped on some moss-crowned rock, and gaily singing, there in the sun his nets the fisher dries. Oft have I heard the plaintive ballad, bringing scenes of past joys before my sorrowing eyes. A happy swain! He waits the accustomed hour, when twilight gloom obscures the closing sky, then gladly seeks his loved paternal bower, and shares the feast his native fields supply, friendship and love, his cottage guests, receive him with honest welcome, and with smile sincere. No threatening woes of present joys bereave him, no sigh his bosom owns, his cheek no tear. Ah, happy swain! Such bliss to me denying, fortune thy lot with envy bids me view, me, who from home and Spain an exile flying, bid all I value, all I love, adieu. No more mine ear shall list the well-known ditty sung by some mountain, girl who tends her goats, some village, swain imploring amorous pity, or shepherd chaunting wild his rustic notes. No more my arms a parent's fond embraces, no more my heart domestic calm, must know, far from these joys, with sighs which memory traces, to sultry skies and distant climes I go, where Indian suns engender new diseases, where snakes and tigers breed. I bend my way to brave the feverish thirst, no art appeases, the yellow plague and madding blaze of day, but not to feel slow pangs consume my liver, to die by piecemeal in the bloom of age, my boiling blood drank by insatiate fever, and brain delirious with the day-star's rage, can make me know such grief, as thus to sever with many a bitter sigh, dear land, from thee, to feel this heart must dote on thee for ever, and feel that all thy joys are torn from me. Ah me! How oft will fancy's spells in slumber recall my native country to my mind, how oft regret will bid me sadly number each lost delight and dear friend left behind. Wild Mercia's vales, and loved romantic bowers, the river on whose banks a child I played, my castle's antient halls, its frowning towers, each much regretted wood and well-known glade, dreams of the land where all my wishes centre, thy scenes, which I am doomed no more to know, full oft shall memory trace, my soul's tormentor, and turn each pleasure past to present woe. But lo! The sun beneath the waves retires, night speeds apace her empire to restore, clouds from my sight obscure the village, spires, now seen but faintly, and now seen no more. Oh, breathe not, winds, still be the water's motion, sleep, sleep, my bark, in silence on the main, so when tomorrow's light shall gild the ocean, once more mine eyes shall see the coast of Spain. Vain is the wish, my last petition scorning, fresh blows the gale, and high the billows swell, far shall we be before the break of morning, oh! Then for ever, native Spain, farewell. Lorenzo had scarcely time to read these lines, when Elvira returned to him. The giving of free course to her tears had relieved her, and her spirits had regained their usual composure. "I have nothing more to say, my lord," said she. "You have heard my apprehensions, and my reasons for begging you not to repeat your visits. I have thrown myself in full confidence upon your honour. I am certain that you will not prove my opinion of you to have been too favourable. But one question more, Signora, and I leave you. Should the Duke of Medina approve my love, would my addresses be unacceptable to yourself and the fair Antonia? I will be open with you, Don Lorenzo, there being little probability of such an union taking place. I fear that it is desired but too ardently by my daughter. You have made an impression upon her young heart, which gives me the most serious alarm, to prevent that impression from growing stronger. I am obliged to decline your acquaintance. For me, you may be sure that I should rejoice at establishing my child so advantageously. Conscious that my constitution, impaired by grief and illness, forbids me to expect a long continuance in this world, I tremble at the thought of leaving her under the protection of a perfect stranger. The Marquis de las Cisternas is totally unknown to me. He will marry. His lady may look upon Antonia with an eye of displeasure, and deprive her of her only friend. Should the Duke, your uncle, give his consent, you need not doubt obtaining mine, and my daughter's, but without his, hope not for ours. At all events, whatever steps you may take, whatever may be the Duke's decision, till you know it, let me beg your forbearing to strengthen by your presence Antonia's prepossession. If the sanction of your relations authorizes your addressing her as your wife, my doors fly open to you. If that sanction is refused, be satisfied to possess my esteem and gratitude, but remember that we must meet no more." Lorenzo promised, reluctantly, to conform to this decree. But he added that he hoped soon to obtain that consent, which would give him a claim to the renewal of their acquaintance. He then explained to her why the Marquis had not called in person, and made no scruple of confiding to her his sister's history. He concluded by saying that he hoped to set Agnes at liberty the next day, and that as soon as Don Raymond's fears were quieted upon this subject, he would lose no time in assuring Donna Elvira of his friendship and protection. The lady shook her head. "I tremble for your sister," said she. "I have heard many traits of the domina of Stanclair's character from a friend who was educated in the same convent with her. She reported her to be haughty, inflexible, superstitious, and revengeful. I have since heard that she is infatuated with the idea of rendering her convent the most regular in Madrid, and never forgave those whose imprudence threw upon it the slightest stain. Though naturally violent and severe, when her interests require it, she well knows how to assume an appearance of benignity. She leaves no means untried to persuade young women of rank to become members of her community. She is implacable when once incensed, and has too much intrepidity to shrink at taking the most rigorous measures for punishing the offender. Doubtless, she will consider your sister's quitting the convent as a disgrace thrown upon it. She will use every artifice to avoid obeying the mandate of His Holiness, and I shudder to think that Donna Agnes is in the hands of this dangerous woman." Lorenzo now rose to take leave. Elvira gave him her hand at parting, which he kissed respectfully, and telling her that he soon hoped for the permission to salute that of Antonia, he returned to his hotel. The lady was perfectly satisfied with the conversation which had passed between them. She looked forward with satisfaction to the prospect of his becoming her son-in-law, but prudence bade her conceal from her daughter's knowledge the flattering hopes which herself now ventured to entertain. Scarcely was it day, and already Lorenzo was at the convent of St. Clair, furnished with the necessary mandate. The nuns were at matins. He waited impatiently for the conclusion of the service, and at length the prioress appeared at the parlour grate. Agnes was demanded. The old lady replied, with a melancholy air, that the dear child's situation grew hourly more dangerous, that the physicians despaired of her life, but that they had declared the only chance for her recovery to consist in keeping her quiet, and not to permit those to approach her whose presence was likely to agitate her. Not a word of all this was believed by Lorenzo, any more than he credited the expressions of grief and affection for Agnes, with which this account was interlarded. To end the business, he put the Pope's bull into the hands of the domina, and insisted that, ill or in health, his sister should be delivered to him without delay. The prioress received the paper with an air of humility, but no sooner had her eye glanced over the contents than her resentment baffled all the efforts of hypocrisy. A deep crimson spread itself over her face, and she darted upon Lorenzo looks of rage and menace. "This order is positive," said she, in a voice of anger, which she in vain strove to disguise. "Willingly would I obey it, but unfortunately it is out of my power." Lorenzo interrupted her by an exclamation of surprise. "I repeat it, Señor, to obey this order is totally out of my power. From tenderness to a brother's feelings, I would have communicated the sad event to you by degrees, and have prepared you to hear it with fortitude. My measures are broken through. This order commands me to deliver up to you the sister Agnes without delay. I am therefore obliged to inform you without circumlocution that on Friday last she expired." Lorenzo started back with horror and turned pale. A moment's recollection convinced him that this assertion must be false, and it restored him to himself. "You deceive me," said he passionately. "But 5 minutes passed since you assured me that though ill she was still alive. Produce her this instant, see her its and will, and every attempt to keep her from me will be unavailing." "You forget yourself, Señor. You owe respect to my age as well as my profession. Your sister is no more. If I at first concealed her death, it was from dreading lest an event so unexpected should produce on you too violent an effect. In truth, I am but ill repaid for my attention. And what interest, I pray you, should I have in detaining her? To know her wish of quitting our society is a sufficient reason for me to wish her absence, and think her a disgrace to the sisterhood of St. Clair, but she has forfeited my affection in a manner yet more culpable. Her crimes were great, and when you know the cause of her death, you will doubtless rejoice, Don Lorenzo, that such a wretch is no longer in existence. She was taken ill on Thursday last on returning from confession in the Capuchin chapel. Her malady seemed attended with strange circumstances, but she persisted in concealing its cause. Thanks to the Virgin, we were too ignorant to suspect it. Judge then what must have been our consternation, our horror, when she was delivered the next day of a stillborn child, whom she immediately followed to the grave. How, Señor? Is it possible that your countenance expresses no surprise, no indignation? Is it possible that your sister's infamy was known to you, and that still she possessed your affection? In that case, you have no need of my compassion. I can say nothing more, except repeat my inability of obeying the orders of His Holiness. Agnes is no more, and to convince you that what I say is true, I swear by our blessed Saviour that 3 days have passed since she was buried. Here she kissed a small crucifix which hung at her girdle. She then rose from her chair and quitted the parlour. As she withdrew, she cast upon Lorenzo a scornful smile. "Farewell, Señor," said she. "I know no remedy for this accident. I fear that even a second bull from the Pope will not procure your sister's resurrection." Lorenzo also retired, penetrated with affliction, but Don Raymond's at the news of this event amounted to madness. He would not be convinced that Agnes was really dead, and continued to insist that the walls of Stanclair still confined her. No arguments could make him abandon his hopes of regaining her. Every day some fresh scheme was invented for procuring intelligence of her, and all of them were attended with the same success. On his part, Medina gave up the idea of ever seeing his sister more, yet he believed that she had been taken off by unfair means. Under this persuasion, he encouraged Don Raymond's researches, determined, should he discover the least warrant for his suspicions, to take a severe vengeance upon the unfeeling prioress. The loss of his sister affected him sincerely, nor was it the least cause of his distress that propriety obliged him for some time to defer mentioning Antonia to the Duke. In the meanwhile, his emissaries constantly surrounded Elvira's door. He had intelligence of all the movements of his mistress, as she never failed every Thursday to attend the sermon in the Capuchin Cathedral. He was secure of seeing her once a week, though in compliance with his promise, he carefully shunned her observation. Thus 2 long months passed away. Still no information was procured of Agnes, all but the Marquis credited her death, and now Lorenzo determined to disclose his sentiments to his uncle. He had already dropped some hints of his intention to marry. They had been as favourably received as he could expect, and he harboured no doubt of the success of his application. Chapter 6. While in each other's arms entrance they lay, they blessed the night and cursed the coming day. Lee. The burst of transport was past. Ambrosio's lust was satisfied, pleasure fled, and shame usurped her seat in his bosom. Confused and terrified at his weakness, he drew himself from Matilda's arms. His perjury presented itself before him. He reflected on the scene which had just been acted, and trembled at the consequences of a discovery. He looked forward with horror, his heart was despondent, and became the abode of satiety and disgust. He avoided the eyes of his partner in frailty. A melancholy silence prevailed, during which both seemed busied with disagreeable reflections. Matilda was the first to break it. She took his hand gently, and pressed it to her burning lips. "Ambrosio," she murmured in a soft and trembling voice. The abbot started at the sound. He turned his eyes upon Matilda's. They were filled with tears. Her cheeks were covered with blushes, and her supplicating looks seemed to solicit his compassion. "Dangerous woman," said he, "into what an abyss of misery have you plunged me? Should your sex be discovered, my honour, nay, my life, must pay for the pleasure of a few moments. Fool that I was, to trust myself to your seductions. What can now be done? How can my offence be expiated? What atonement can purchase the pardon of my crime? Wretched Matilda, you have destroyed my quiet for ever." "To me, these reproaches, Ambrosio? To me, who have sacrificed for you the world's pleasures, the luxury of wealth, the delicacy of sex, my friends, my fortune, and my fame? What have you lost which I preserved? Have I not shared in your guilt? Have you not shared in my pleasure? Guilt, did I say? In what consists ours, unless in the opinion of an ill-judging world? Let that world be ignorant of them, and our joys become divine and blameless. Unnatural were your vows of celibacy. Man was not created for such a state, and were love a crime, God never would have made it so sweet, so irresistible. And banish those clouds from your brow, my Ambrosio. Indulge in those pleasures freely, without which life is a worthless gift. Cease to reproach me with having taught you what is bliss, and feel equal transports with the woman who adores you." As she spoke, her eyes were filled with a delicious languor. Her bosom panted, she twined her arms voluptuously round him, drew him towards her, and glued her lips to his. Ambrosio again raged with desire. The die was thrown, his vows were already broken, he had already committed the crime, and why should he refrain from enjoying its reward? He clasped her to his breast with redoubled ardour. No longer repressed by the sense of shame, he gave a loose to his intemperate appetites. Now the fair wanton put every invention of lust in practice, every refinement in the art of pleasure which might heighten the bliss of her possession and render her lover's transport still more exquisite. Ambrosio rioted in delights, till then unknown to him. Swift fled the night, and the morning blushed to behold him, still clasped in the embraces of Matilda. Intoxicated with pleasure, the monk rose from the siren's luxurious couch. He no longer reflected with shame upon his incontinence or dreaded the vengeance of offended heaven. His only fear was lest death should rob him of enjoyments, for which his long fast had only given a keener edge to his appetite. Matilda was still under the influence of poison, and the voluptuous monk trembled less for his preserver's life than his concubine's. Deprived of her, he would not easily find another mistress with whom he could indulge his passions so fully and so safely. He therefore pressed her with earnestness to use the means of preservation which she had declared to be in her possession. "Yes," replied Matilda, "since you have made me feel that life is valuable, I will rescue mine at any rate. No danger shall appall me. I will look upon the consequences of my action boldly, nor shudder at the horrors which they present. I will think my sacrifice scarcely worthy to purchase your possession, and remember that a moment passed in your arms in this world pays an age of punishment in the next. But before I take this step, Ambrosio, give me your solemn oath never to inquire by what means I shall preserve myself." He did so in a manner the most binding. "I thank you, my beloved. This precaution is necessary, for though you know it not, you are under the command of vulgar prejudices. The business on which I must be employed this night might startle you from its singularity and lower me in your opinion. Tell me, are you possessed of the key of the low door on the western side of the garden? The door which opens into the burying ground common to us and the sisterhood of St. Clare. I have not the key, but can easily procure it. You have only this to do. Admit me into the burying ground at midnight, watch while I descend into the vaults of St. Clare, lest some prying eye should observe my actions, leave me there alone for an hour, and that life is safe which I dedicate to your pleasures. To prevent creating suspicion, do not visit me during the day. Remember the key, and that I expect you before 12. Hark! I hear steps approaching. Leave me, I will pretend to sleep." And the friar obeyed and left the cell. As he opened the door, Father Pablo's made his appearance. "I come," said the latter, "to inquire after the health of my young patient." "Hush," replied Ambrosio, laying his finger upon his lip. "Speak softly. I am just come from him. He has fallen into a profound slumber, which doubtless will be of service to him. Do not disturb him at present, for he wishes to repose." Father Pablos obeyed, and hearing the bell ring, accompanied the abbot to matins. Ambrosio felt embarrassed as he entered the chapel. Guilt was new to him, and he fancied that every eye could read the transactions of the night upon his countenance. He strove to pray, his bosom no longer glowed with devotion, his thoughts insensibly wandered to Matilda's secret charms. But what he wanted in purity of heart, he supplied by exterior sanctity. The better to cloak his transgression, he redoubled his pretensions to the semblance of virtue, and never appeared more devoted to heaven as since he had broken through his engagements. Thus did he unconsciously add hypocrisy to perjury and incontinence. He had fallen into the latter errors from yielding to seduction almost irresistible, but he was now guilty of a voluntary fault by endeavouring to conceal those into which another had betrayed him. The matins concluded, Ambrosio retired to his cell. The pleasures which he had just tasted for the first time were still impressed upon his mind. His brain was bewildered and presented the confused chaos of remorse, voluptuousness, inquietude, and fear. He looked back with regret to that peace of soul, that security of virtue, which till then had been his portion. He had indulged in excesses whose very idea but 24 hours before he had recoiled at with horror. He shuddered at reflecting that a trifling indiscretion on his part, or on Matilda's, would overturn that fabric of reputation which it had cost him 30 years to erect, and render him the abhorrence of that people of whom he was then the idol. Conscience painted to him in glaring colours his perjury and weakness. Apprehension magnified to him the horrors of punishment, and he already fancied himself in the prisons of the Inquisition. To these tormenting ideas succeeded Matilda's beauty, and those delicious lessons which, once learnt, can never be forgotten. A single glance thrown upon these reconciled him with himself. He considered the pleasures of the former night to have been purchased at an easy price by the sacrifice of innocence and honour. Their very remembrance filled his soul with ecstasy. He cursed his foolish vanity, which had induced him to waste in obscurity the bloom of life, ignorant of the blessings of love and woman. He determined at all events to continue his commerce with Matilda, and called every argument to his aid which might confirm his resolution. He asked himself, provided his irregularity was unknown, in what would his fault consist, and what consequences he had to apprehend. By adhering strictly to every rule of his order save chastity, he doubted not to retain the esteem of men, and even the protection of heaven. He trusted easily to be forgiven so slight and natural a deviation from his vows, but he forgot that having pronounced those vows, incontinence, in layman the most venial of errors, became in his person the most heinous of crimes. Once decided upon his future conduct, his mind became more easy. He threw himself upon his bed and strove by sleeping to recruit his strength exhausted by his nocturnal excesses. He awoke refreshed and eager for a repetition of his pleasures. Obedient to Matilda's order, he visited not her cell during the day. Father Pablo's mentioned in the refectory that Rosario had at length been prevailed upon to follow his prescription, but that the medicine had not produced the slightest effect, and that he believed no mortal skill could rescue him from the grave. With this opinion the abbot agreed, and affected to lament the untimely fate of a youth whose talents had appeared so promising. The night arrived. Ambrosio had taken care to procure from the porter the key of the low door opening into the cemetery. Furnished with this, when all was silent in the monastery, he quitted his cell and hastened to Matilda's. She had left her bed and was dressed before his arrival. "I have been expecting you with impatience," said she. "My life depends upon these moments." "Have you the key?" "I have." "Away then to the garden. We have no time to lose. Follow me." She took a small covered basket from the table. Bearing this in one hand, and the lamp, which was flaming upon the hearth, in the other, she hastened from the cell. Ambrosio followed her. Both maintained a profound silence. She moved on with quick but cautious steps, passed through the cloisters, and reached the western side of the garden. Her eyes flashed with a fire and wildness which impressed the monk at once with awe and horror. A determined, desperate courage reigned upon her brow. She gave the lamp to Ambrosio, then taking from him the key, she unlocked the low door and entered the cemetery. It was a vast and spacious square planted with yew trees. Half of it belonged to the abbey, the other half was the property of the sisterhood of St. Clare, and was protected by a roof of stone. The division was marked by an iron railing, the wicket of which was generally left unlocked. Thither Matilda bent her course. She opened the wicket and sought for the door leading to the subterraneous vaults, where reposed the mouldering bodies of the votaries of St. Clare. The night was perfectly dark, neither moon or stars were visible. Luckily there was not a breath of wind, and the friar bore his lamp in full security. By the assistance of its beams, the door of the sepulchre was soon discovered. It was sunk within the hollow of a wall, and almost concealed by thick festoons of ivy hanging over it. 3 steps of rough-hewn stone conducted to it, and Matilda was on the point of descending them when she suddenly started back. "There are people in the vaults," she whispered to the monk. "Conceal yourself till they are past." She took refuge behind a lofty and magnificent tomb, erected in honour of the convent's foundress. Ambrosio followed her example, carefully hiding his lamp, lest its beams should betray them. But a few moments had elapsed when the door was pushed open leading to the subterraneous caverns. Rays of light proceeded up the staircase. They enabled the concealed spectators to observe 2 females, dressed in religious habits, who seemed engaged in earnest conversation. The abbot had no difficulty to recognize the prioress of St. Clare in the first, and one of the elder nuns in her companion. "Everything is prepared," said the prioress. "Her fate shall be decided tomorrow. All her tears and sighs will be unavailing. No, in 25 years that I have been superior of this convent, never did I witness a transaction more infamous." "You must expect much opposition to your will," the other replied in a milder voice. "Agnes has many friends in the convent, and in particular the Mother Saint Ursula will espouse her cause most warmly. In truth, she merits to have friends, and I wish I could prevail upon you to consider her youth and her peculiar situation. She seems sensible of her fault, the excess of her grief proves her penitence, and I am convinced that her tears flow more from contrition than fear of punishment. Reverend Mother, would you be persuaded to mitigate the severity of your sentence? Would you but deign to overlook this first transgression, I offer myself as the pledge of her future conduct." "Overlook it, say you? Mother Camilla, you amaze me. What, after disgracing me in the presence of Madrid's idol, of the very man on whom I most wished to impress an idea of the strictness of my discipline, how despicable must I have appeared to the reverend abbot? No, mother, no, I never can forgive the insult. I cannot better convince Ambrosio that I abhor such crimes than by punishing that of Agnes with all the rigour of which our severe laws admit. Cease then your supplications, they will all be unavailing. My resolution is taken. Tomorrow Agnes shall be made a terrible example of my justice and resentment." The mother Camilla seemed not to give up the point, but by this time the nuns were out of hearing. A prioress unlocked a door which communicated with St. Clare's chapel, and having entered with her companion, closed it again after them. Matilda now asked, who was this Agnes, with whom the prioress was thus incensed, and what connection she could have with Ambrosio. He related her adventure, and he added, that since that time, his ideas having undergone a thorough revolution, he now felt much compassion for the unfortunate nun. "I design," said he, "to request an audience of the domina tomorrow, and use every means of obtaining a mitigation of her sentence." "Beware of what you do," interrupted Matilda. "Your sudden change of sentiment may naturally create surprise, and may give birth to suspicions which it is most our interest to avoid. Rather, redouble your outward austerity, and thunder out menaces against the errors of others, the better to conceal your own. Abandon the nun to her fate. Your interfering might be dangerous, and her imprudence merits to be punished. She is unworthy to enjoy love's pleasures, who has not wit enough to conceal them. But in discussing this trifling subject, I waste moments which are precious. The night flies apace, and much must be done before morning. The nuns are retired, all is safe. Give me the lamp, Ambrosio. I must descend alone into these caverns. Wait here, and if anyone approaches, warn me by your voice. But as you value your existence, presume not to follow me. Your life would fall a victim to your imprudent curiosity." Thus saying, she advanced towards the sepulchre, still holding her lamp in one hand and her little basket in the other. She touched the door. It turned slowly upon its grating hinges, and a narrow, winding staircase of black marble presented itself to her eyes. She descended it. Ambrosio remained above, watching the faint beams of the lamp as they still proceeded up the stairs. They disappeared, and he found himself in total darkness. Left to himself, he could not reflect without surprise on the sudden change in Matilda's character and sentiments. But a few days had passed since she appeared the mildest and softest of her sex, devoted to his will and looking up to him as to a superior being. Now she assumed a sort of courage and manliness in her manners and discourse, but ill calculated to please him. She spoke no longer to insinuate, but command. He found himself unable to cope with her in argument, and was unwillingly obliged to confess the superiority of her judgment. Every moment convinced him of the astonishing powers of her mind, but what she gained in the opinion of the man, she lost with interest in the affection of the lover. He regretted Rosario, the fond, the gentle and submissive. He grieved that Matilda preferred the virtues of his sex to those of her own, and when he thought of her expressions respecting the devoted nun, he could not help blaming them as cruel and unfeminine. Pity is a sentiment so natural, so appropriate to the female character, that it is scarcely a merit for a woman to possess it, but to be without it is a grievous crime. Ambrosio could not easily forgive his mistress for being deficient in this amiable quality. However, though he blamed her insensibility, he felt the truth of her observations, and though he pitied sincerely the unfortunate Agnes, he resolved to drop the idea of interposing in her behalf. Near an hour had elapsed since Matilda descended into the caverns. Still she returned not. Ambrosio's curiosity was excited. He drew near the staircase. He listened. All was silent, except that at intervals he caught the sound of Matilda's voice as it wound along the subterraneous passages and was re-echoed by the sepulchre's vaulted roofs. She was at too great a distance for him to distinguish her words, and ere they reached him they were deadened into a low murmur. He longed to penetrate into this mystery. He resolved to disobey her injunctions and follow her into the cavern. He advanced to the staircase. He had already descended some steps when his courage failed him. He remembered Matilda's menaces if he infringed her orders, and his bosom was filled with a secret, unaccountable awe. He returned up the stairs, resumed his former station, and waited impatiently for the conclusion of this adventure. Suddenly he was sensible of a violent shock. An earthquake rocked the ground. The columns which supported the roof under which he stood were so strongly shaken that every moment menaced him with its fall, and at the same moment he heard a loud and tremendous burst of thunder. It ceased, and his eyes being fixed upon the staircase, he saw a bright column of light flash along the caverns beneath. It was seen but for an instant. No sooner did it disappear than all was once more quiet and obscure. Profound darkness again surrounded him, and the silence of night was only broken by the whirring bat as she flitted slowly by him. With every instant Ambrosio's amazement increased. Another hour elapsed, after which the same light again appeared and was lost again as suddenly. It was accompanied by a strain of sweet but solemn music which, as it stole through the vaults below, inspired the monk with mingled delight and terror. It had not long been hushed when he heard Matilda's steps upon the staircase. She ascended from the cavern. The most lively joy animated her beautiful features. "Did you see anything?" she asked. "Twice I saw a column of light flash up the staircase." "Nothing else?" "Nothing." "The morning is on the point of breaking. Let us retire to the abbey, lest daylight should betray us." With a light step she hastened from the burying ground. She regained her cell, and the curious abbot still accompanied her. She closed the door and disembarrassed herself of her lamp and basket. "I have succeeded," she cried, throwing herself upon his bosom, "succeeded beyond my fondest hopes. I shall live, Ambrosio, shall live for you. The step which I shuddered at taking proves to me a source of joys inexpressible. Oh, that I dared communicate those joys to you! Oh, that I were permitted to share with you my power, and raise you as high above the level of your sex as one bold deed has exalted me above mine." "And what prevents you, Matilda?" interrupted the friar. "Why is your business in the cavern made a secret? Do you think me undeserving of your confidence? Matilda, I must doubt the truth of your affection, while you have joys in which I am forbidden to share. You reproach me with injustice. I grieve sincerely that I am obliged to conceal from you my happiness. But I am not to blame. The fault lies not in me, but in yourself, my Ambrosio. You are still too much the monk. Your mind is enslaved by the prejudices of education, and superstition might make you shudder at the idea of that which experience has taught me to prize and value. At present you are unfit to be trusted with a secret of such importance. But the strength of your judgment, and the curiosity which I rejoice to see sparkling in your eyes, makes me hope that you will one day deserve my confidence. Till that period arrives, restrain your impatience. Remember that you have given me your solemn oath never to inquire into this night's adventures. I insist upon your keeping this oath, for though," she added smiling, while she sealed his lips with a wanton kiss, "though I forgive your breaking your vows to heaven, I expect you to keep your vows to me." The friar returned the embrace which had set his blood on fire. The luxurious and unbounded excesses of the former night were renewed, and they separated not till the bell rang for matins. The same pleasures were frequently repeated. The monks rejoiced in the feigned Rosario's unexpected recovery, and none of them suspected his real sex. The abbot possessed his mistress in tranquillity, and perceiving his frailty unsuspected, abandoned himself to his passions in full security. Shame and remorse no longer tormented him. Frequent repetitions made him familiar with sin, and his bosom became proof against the stings of conscience. In these sentiments he was encouraged by Matilda, but she soon was aware that she had satiated her lover by the unbounded freedom of her caresses. Her charms becoming accustomed to him, they ceased to excite the same desires which at first they had inspired. The delirium of passion being past, he had leisure to observe every trifling defect, where none were to be found. Satiety made him fancy them. The monk was glutted with the fullness of pleasure. A week had scarcely elapsed before he was wearied of his paramour. His warm constitution still made him seek in her arms the gratification of his lust. But when the moment of passion was over, he quitted her with disgust, and his humour, naturally inconstant, made him sigh impatiently for variety. Possession, which cloys man, only increases the affection of woman. Matilda with every succeeding day grew more attached to the friar. Since he had obtained her favours, he was become dearer to her than ever, and she felt grateful to him for the pleasures in which they had equally been sharers. Unfortunately, as her passion grew ardent, Ambrosio's grew cold. The very marks of her fondness excited his disgust, and its excess served to extinguish the flame which already burned but feebly in his bosom. Matilda could not but remark that her society seemed to him daily less agreeable. He was inattentive while she spoke. Her musical talents, which she possessed in perfection, had lost the power of amusing him, or if he deigned to praise them, his compliments were evidently forced and cold. He no longer gazed upon her with affection, or applauded her sentiments with a lover's partiality. This Matilda well perceived, and redoubled her efforts to revive those sentiments which she once had felt. She could not but fail, since he considered as importunities the pains which she took to please him, and was disgusted by the very means which she used to recall the wanderer. Still, however, their illicit commerce continued, but it was clear that he was led to her arms not by love, but the cravings of brutal appetite. His constitution made a woman necessary to him, and Matilda was the only one with whom he could indulge his passions safely, in spite of her beauty. He gazed upon every other female with more desire, but fearing that his hypocrisy should be made public, he confined his inclinations to his own breast. It was by no means his nature to be timid, but his education had impressed his mind with fear so strongly that apprehension was now become part of his character. Had his youth been passed in the world, he would have shown himself possessed of many brilliant and manly qualities. He was naturally enterprising, firm, and fearless. He had a warrior's heart, and he might have shone with splendor at the head of an army. There was no want of generosity in his nature. The wretched never failed to find in him a compassionate auditor. His abilities were quick and shining, and his judgment vast, solid, and decisive. With such qualifications he would have been an ornament to his country. That he possessed them, he had given proofs in his earliest infancy, and his parents had beheld his dawning virtues with the fondest delight and admiration. Unfortunately, while yet a child, he was deprived of those parents. He fell into the power of a relation, whose only wish about him was never to hear of him more. For that purpose he gave him in charge to his friend, the former superior of the Capuchins. The abbot, a very monk, used all his endeavours to persuade the boy that happiness existed not without the walls of a convent. He succeeded fully. To deserve admittance into the order of St. Francis was Ambrosio's highest ambition. His instructors carefully repressed those virtues whose grandeur and disinterestedness were ill-suited to the cloister. Instead of universal benevolence, he adopted a selfish partiality for his own particular establishment. He was taught to consider compassion for the errors of others as a crime of the blackest dye. The noble frankness of his temper was exchanged for servile humility. And in order to break his natural spirit, the monks terrified his young mind by placing before him all the horrors with which superstition could furnish them. They painted to him the torments of the damned in colours, the most dark, terrible, and fantastic, and threatened him at the slightest fault with eternal perdition. No wonder that his imagination constantly dwelling upon these fearful objects should have rendered his character timid and apprehensive. Add to this, that his long absence from the great world, and total unacquaintance with the common dangers of life, made him form of them an idea far more dismal than the reality. While the monks were busied in rooting out his virtues and narrowing his sentiments, they allowed every vice which had fallen to his share to arrive at full perfection. He was suffered to be proud, vain, ambitious, and disdainful. He was jealous of his equals, and despised all merit but his own. He was implacable when offended, and cruel in his revenge. Still, in spite of the pains taken to pervert them, his natural good qualities would occasionally break through the gloom cast over them so carefully. At such times the contest for superiority between his real and acquired character was striking and unaccountable to those unacquainted with his original disposition. He pronounced the most severe sentences upon offenders which, the moment after, compassion induced him to mitigate. He undertook the most daring enterprises which the fear of their consequences soon obliged him to abandon. His inborn genius darted a brilliant light upon subjects the most obscure, and almost instantaneously his superstition replunged them in darkness more profound than that from which they had just been rescued. His brother monks, regarding him as a superior being, remarked not this contradiction in their idol's conduct. They were persuaded that what he did must be right, and supposed him to have good reasons for changing his resolutions. The fact was that the different sentiments with which education and nature had inspired him were combating in his bosom. It remained for his passions, which as yet no opportunity had called into play, to decide the victory. Unfortunately, his passions were the very worst judges to whom he could possibly have applied. His monastic seclusion had till now been in his favour, since it gave him no room for discovering his bad qualities. The superiority of his talents raised him too far above his companions to permit his being jealous of them. His exemplary piety, persuasive eloquence, and pleasing manners had secured him universal esteem, and consequently he had no injuries to revenge. His ambition was justified by his acknowledged merit, and his pride considered as no more than proper confidence. He never saw, much less conversed with, the other sex. He was ignorant of the pleasures in woman's power to bestow, and if he read in the course of his studies that men were fond, he smiled and wondered how. For a time, spare diet, frequent watching, and severe penance cooled and repressed the natural warmth of his constitution. But no sooner did opportunity present itself, no sooner did he catch a glimpse of joys to which he was still a stranger, than religion's barriers were too feeble to resist the overwhelming torrent of his desires. All impediments yielded before the force of his temperament, warm, sanguine, and voluptuous in the excess. As yet his other passions lay dormant, but they only needed to be once awakened to display themselves with violence as great and irresistible. He continued to be the admiration of Madrid. The enthusiasm created by his eloquence seemed rather to increase than diminish. Every Thursday, which was the only day when he appeared in public, the Capuchin cathedral was crowded with auditors, and his discourse was always received with the same approbation. He was named confessor to all the chief families in Madrid, and no one was counted fashionable who was enjoined penance by any other than Ambrosio. In his resolution of never stirring out of his convent, he still persisted. This circumstance created a still greater opinion of his sanctity and self-denial. Above all, the women sang forth his praises loudly, less influenced by devotion than by his noble countenance, majestic air, and well-turned, graceful figure. The abbey door was thronged with carriages from morning to night, and the noblest and fairest dames of Madrid confessed to the abbot their secret peccadillos. The eyes of the luxurious friar devoured their charms, had his penitents consulted those interpreters. He would have needed no other means of expressing his desires. For his misfortune, they were so strongly persuaded of his continence that the possibility of his harbouring indecent thoughts never once entered their imaginations. The climate's heat, 'tis well known, operates with no small influence upon the constitutions of the Spanish ladies, but the most abandoned would have thought it an easier task to inspire with passion the marble statue of Saint Francis than the cold and rigid heart of the immaculate Ambrosio. On his part, the friar was little acquainted with the depravity of the world. He suspected not that but few of his penitents would have rejected his addresses. Yet had he been better instructed on this head, the danger attending such an attempt would have sealed up his lips in silence. He knew that it would be difficult for a woman to keep a secret so strange and so important as his frailty, and he even trembled lest Matilda should betray him. Anxious to preserve a reputation which was infinitely dear to him, he saw all the risk of committing it to the power of some vain, giddy female, and as the beauties of Madrid affected only his senses without touching his heart, he forgot them as soon as they were out of his sight. The danger of discovery, the fear of being repulsed, the loss of reputation, all these considerations counselled him to stifle his desires, and though he now felt for it the most perfect indifference, he was necessitated to confine himself to Matilda's person. One morning, the confluence of penitents was greater than usual. He was detained in the confessional chair till a late hour. At length the crowd was dispatched, and he prepared to quit the chapel, when two females entered and drew near him with humility. They threw up their veils, and the youngest entreated him to listen to her for a few moments. The melody of her voice, of that voice to which no man ever listened without interest, immediately caught Ambrosio's attention. He stopped. The petitioner seemed bowed down with affliction. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes dimmed with tears, and her hair fell in disorder over her face and bosom. Still her countenance was so sweet, so innocent, so heavenly, as might have charmed an heart less susceptible than that which panted in the abbot's breast. With more than usual softness of manner he desired her to proceed, and heard her speak as follows with an emotion which increased every moment. "Reverend Father, you see an unfortunate, threatened with the loss of her dearest, of almost her only friend. My mother, my excellent mother, lies upon the bed of sickness. A sudden and dreadful malady seized her last night, and so rapid has been its progress that the physicians despair of her life. Human aid fails me, nothing remains for me but to implore the mercy of heaven. Father, all Madrid rings with the report of your piety and virtue. Deign to remember my mother in your prayers, perhaps they may prevail on the Almighty to spare her, and should that be the case, I engage myself every Thursday in the next 3 months to illuminate the shrine of St. Francis in his honour." So, thought the monk, here we have a second Vincentio della Ronda. Rosario's adventure began thus, and he wished secretly that this might have the same conclusion. He acceded to the request. The petitioner returned him thanks with every mark of gratitude, and then continued. "I have yet another favour to ask. We are strangers in Madrid, my mother needs a confessor, and knows not to whom she should apply. We understand that you never quit the abbey, and alas, my poor mother is unable to come hither. If you would have the goodness, Reverend Father, to name a proper person, whose wise and pious consolations may soften the agonies of my parents' deathbed, you will confer an everlasting favour upon hearts not ungrateful." With this petition also the monk complied. Indeed, what petition would he have refused, if urged in such enchanting accents? The suppliant was so interesting, her voice was so sweet, so harmonious. Her very tears became her, and her affliction seemed to add new lustre to her charms. He promised to send to her a confessor that same evening, and begged her to leave her address. The companion presented him with a card on which it was written, and then withdrew with the fair petitioner, who pronounced before her departure 1,000 benedictions on the abbot's goodness. His eyes followed her out of the chapel. It was not till she was out of sight that he examined the card, on which he read the following words: Donna Elvira d'Alfa, Strada di San Iago, 4 doors from the Palace d'Albornoz. The suppliant was no other than Antonia, and Leonela was her companion. The latter had not consented without difficulty to accompany her niece to the abbey. Ambrosio had inspired her with such awe that she trembled at the very sight of him. Her fears had conquered even her natural loquacity, and while in his presence she uttered not a single syllable. The monk retired to his cell, whither he was pursued by Antonia's image. He felt 1,000 new emotions springing in his bosom, and he trembled to examine into the cause which gave them birth. They were totally different from those inspired by Matilda when she first declared her sex and her affection. He felt not the provocation of lust, no voluptuous desires rioted in his bosom, nor did a burning imagination picture to him the charms which modesty had veiled from his eyes. On the contrary, what he now felt was a mingled sentiment of tenderness, admiration, and respect. A soft and delicious melancholy infused itself into his soul, and he would not have exchanged it for the most lively transports of joy. Society now disgusted him. He delighted in solitude, which permitted his indulging the visions of fancy. His thoughts were all gentle, sad, and soothing, and the whole wide world presented him with no other object than Antonia. "Happy man," he exclaimed in his romantic enthusiasm, "happy man, who is destined to possess the heart of that lovely girl. What delicacy in her features, what elegance in her form! How enchanting was the timid innocence of her eyes, and how different from the wanton expression, the wild, luxurious fire which sparkles in Matilda's! Oh, sweeter must one kiss be snatched from the rosy lips of the first than all the full and lustful favours bestowed so freely by the second. Matilda gluts me with enjoyment even to loathing, forces me to her arms, apes the harlot, and glories in her prostitution. Disgusting! Did she know the inexpressible charm of modesty, how irresistibly it enthralls the heart of man, how firmly it chains him to the throne of beauty, she never would have thrown it off. What would be too dear a price for this lovely girl's affections? What would I refuse to sacrifice, could I be released from my vows and permitted to declare my love in the sight of earth and heaven? While I strove to inspire her with tenderness, with friendship and esteem, how tranquil and undisturbed would the hours roll away. Gracious God, to see her blue downcast eyes beam upon mine with timid fondness, to sit for days, for years, listening to that gentle voice, to acquire the right of obliging her, and hear the artless expressions of her gratitude, to watch the emotions of her spotless heart, to encourage each dawning virtue, to share in her joy when happy, to kiss away her tears when distressed, and to see her fly to my arms for comfort and support. Yes, if there is perfect bliss on earth, 'tis his lot alone, who becomes that angel's husband. While his fancy coined these ideas, he paced his cell with a disordered air. His eyes were fixed upon vacancy, his head reclined upon his shoulder, a tear rolled down his cheek, while he reflected that the vision of happiness for him could never be realized. "She is lost to me," he continued. "By marriage she cannot be mine, and to seduce such innocence, to use the confidence reposed in me to work her ruin. Oh, it would be a crime, blacker than yet the world ever witnessed. Fear not, lovely girl, your virtue runs no risk from me. Not for Indies would I make that gentle bosom know the tortures of remorse." Again he paced his chamber hastily. Then stopping, his eye fell upon the picture of his once admired Madonna. He tore it with indignation from the wall, he threw it on the ground, and spurned it from him with his foot. The prostitute, unfortunate Matilda! Her paramour forgot that for his sake alone she had forfeited her claim to virtue, and his only reason for despising her was that she had loved him much too well. He threw himself into a chair which stood near the table. He saw the card with Elvira's address. He took it up, and it brought to his recollection his promise respecting a confessor. He passed a few minutes in doubt, but Antonia's empire over him was already too much decided to permit his making a long resistance to the idea which struck him. He resolved to be the confessor himself. He could leave the abbey unobserved without difficulty. By wrapping up his head in his cowl, he hoped to pass through the streets without being recognized. By taking these precautions, and by recommending secrecy to Elvira's family, he doubted not to keep Madrid in ignorance that he had broken his vow never to see the outside of the abbey walls. Matilda was the only person whose vigilance he dreaded, that by informing her at the refectory that during the whole of that day business would confine him to his cell, he thought himself secure from her wakeful jealousy. Accordingly, at the hours when the Spaniards are generally taking their siesta, he ventured to quit the abbey by a private door, the key of which was in his possession. The cowl of his habit was thrown over his face. From the heat of the weather, the streets were almost totally deserted. The monk met with few people, found the Strada di San Iago, and arrived without accident at Donna Elvira's door. He rang, was admitted, and immediately ushered into an upper apartment. It was here that he ran the greatest risk of a discovery. Had Leonela been at home, she would have recognized him directly. Her communicative disposition would never have permitted her to rest till all Madrid was informed that Ambrosio had ventured out of the abbey and visited her sister. Fortune here stood the monk's friend. On Leonela's return home, she found a letter instructing her that a cousin was just dead, who had left what little he possessed between herself and Elvira. To secure this bequest, she was obliged to set out for Cordova without losing a moment. Amidst all her foibles, her heart was truly warm and affectionate, and she was unwilling to quit her sister in so dangerous a state. But Elvira insisted upon her taking the journey, conscious that in her daughter's forlorn situation no increase of fortune, however trifling, ought to be neglected. Accordingly, Leonela left Madrid, sincerely grieved at her sister's illness, and giving some few sighs to the memory of the amiable but inconstant Don Cristoval. She was fully persuaded that at first she had made a terrible breach in his heart, but hearing nothing more of him, she supposed that he had quitted the pursuit, disgusted by the lowness of her origin, and knowing upon other terms than marriage he had nothing to hope from such a dragon of virtue as she professed herself, or else that being naturally capricious and changeable, the remembrance of her charms had been effaced from the Conde's heart by those of some newer beauty. Whatever was the cause of her losing him, she lamented it sorely. She strove in vain, as she assured everybody who was kind enough to listen to her, to tear his image from her too susceptible heart. She affected the airs of a lovesick virgin, and carried them all to the most ridiculous excess. She heaved lamentable sighs, walked with her arms folded, uttered long soliloquies, and her discourse generally turned upon some forsaken maid who expired of a broken heart. Her fiery locks were always ornamented with a garland of willow. Every evening she was seen straying upon the banks of a rivulet by moonlight, and she declared herself a violent admirer of murmuring streams and nightingales, of lonely haunts and twilight groves, places which pale passion loves. Such was the state of Leonela's mind when obliged to quit Madrid. Elvira was out of patience at all these follies, and endeavoured at persuading her to act like a reasonable woman. Her advice was thrown away. Leonela assured her at parting that nothing could make her forget the perfidious Don Cristoval. In this point she was fortunately mistaken. An honest youth of Cordova, journeyman to an apothecary, found that her fortune would be sufficient to set him up in a genteel shop of his own. In consequence of this reflection he avowed himself her admirer. Leonela was not inflexible. The ardour of his sighs melted her heart, and she soon consented to make him the happiest of mankind. She wrote to inform her sister of her marriage, but, for reasons which will be explained hereafter, Elvira never answered her letter. Ambrosio was conducted into the antechamber, to that where Elvira was reposing. The female domestic who had admitted him left him alone while she announced his arrival to her mistress. Antonia, who had been by her mother's bedside, immediately came to him. "Pardon me, father," said she, advancing towards him, when, recognizing his features, she stopped suddenly and uttered a cry of joy. "Is it possible?" she continued. "Do not my eyes deceive me? Has the worthy Ambrosio broken through his resolution that he may soften the agonies of the best of women? What pleasure will this visit give my mother? Let me not delay for a moment the comfort which your piety and wisdom will afford her." Thus saying, she opened the chamber door, presented to her mother her distinguished visitor, and having placed an armchair by the side of the bed, withdrew into another department. Elvira was highly gratified by this visit. Her expectations had been raised high by general report, but she found them far exceeded. Ambrosio, endowed by nature with powers of pleasing, exerted them to the utmost while conversing with Antonia's mother. With persuasive eloquence he calmed every fear and dissipated every scruple. He bade her reflect on the infinite mercy of her judge, despoiled death of his darts and terrors, and taught her to view without shrinking the abyss of eternity on whose brink she then stood. Elvira was absorbed in attention and delight. While she listened to his exhortations, confidence and comfort stole insensibly into her mind. She unbosomed to him without hesitation her cares and apprehensions. The latter, respecting a future life, he had already quieted, and he now removed the former, which she felt for the concerns of this. She trembled for Antonia. She had none to whose care she could recommend her, save to the Marquis de las Cisternas and her sister Leonela. The protection of the one was very uncertain, and as to the other, though fond of her niece, Leonela was so thoughtless and vain as to make her an improper person to have the sole direction of a girl so young and ignorant of the world. The friar no sooner learnt the cause of her alarms than he begged her to make herself easy upon that head. He doubted not being able to secure for Antonia a safe refuge in the house of one of his penitents, the Marchioness of Villafranca. This was a lady of acknowledged virtue, remarkable for strict principles and extensive charity. Should accident deprive her of this resource, he engaged to procure Antonia a reception in some respectable convent, that is to say, in quality of boarder, for Elvira had declared herself no friend to a monastic life, and the monk was either candid or complaisant enough to allow that her disapprobation was not unfounded. These proofs of the interest which he felt for her completely won Elvira's heart. In thanking him she exhausted every expression which gratitude could furnish, and protested that now she should resign herself with tranquillity to the grave. Ambrosio rose to take leave. He promised to return the next day at the same hour, but requested that his visits might be kept secret. "I am unwilling," said he, "that my breaking through a rule imposed by necessity should be generally known. Had I not resolved never to quit my convent, except upon circumstances as urgent as that which has conducted me to your door, I should be frequently summoned upon insignificant occasions. That time would be engrossed by the curious, the unoccupied, and the fanciful, which I now pass at the bedside of the sick, in comforting the expiring penitent and clearing the passage to eternity from thorns." Elvira commended equally his prudence and compassion, promising to conceal carefully the honour of his visits. The monk then gave her his benediction, and retired from the chamber. In the anteroom he found Antonia. He could not refuse himself the pleasure of passing a few moments in her society. He bade her take comfort, for that her mother seemed composed and tranquil, and he hoped that she might yet do well. He inquired who attended her, and engaged to send the physician of his convent to see her, one of the most skilful in Madrid. He then launched out in Elvira's commendation, praised her purity and fortitude of mind, and declared that she had inspired him with the highest esteem and reverence. Antonia's innocent heart swelled with gratitude. Joy danced in her eyes, where a tear still sparkled. The hopes which he gave her of her mother's recovery, the lively interest which he seemed to feel for her, and the flattering way in which she was mentioned by him, added to the report of his judgment and virtue, and to the impression made upon her by his eloquence, confirmed the favourable opinion with which his first appearance had inspired Antonia. She replied with diffidence, but without restraint. She feared not to relate to him all her little sorrows, all her little fears and anxieties, and she thanked him for his goodness with all the genuine warmth which favours kindle in a young and innocent heart. Such alone know how to estimate benefits at their full value. They who are conscious of mankind's perfidy and selfishness ever receive an obligation with apprehension and distrust. They suspect that some secret motive must lurk behind it. They express their thanks with restraint and caution, and fear to praise a kind action to its full extent, aware that some future day a return may be required. Not so Antonia. She thought the world was composed only of those who resembled her, and that vice existed was to her still a secret. The monk had been of service to her. He said that he wished her well. She was grateful for his kindness, and thought that no terms were strong enough to be the vehicle of her thanks. With what delight did Ambrosio listen to the declaration of her artless gratitude! The natural grace of her manners, the unequalled sweetness of her voice, her modest vivacity, her unstudied elegance, her expressive countenance, and intelligent eyes united to inspire him with pleasure and admiration, while the solidity and correctness of her remarks received additional beauty from the unaffected simplicity of the language in which they were conveyed. Ambrosio was at length obliged to tear himself from this conversation which possessed for him but too many charms. He repeated to Antonia his wishes that his visits should not be made known, which desire she promised to observe. He then quitted the house, while his enchantress hastened to her mother, ignorant of the mischief which her beauty had caused. She was eager to know Elvira's opinion of the man whom she had praised in such enthusiastic terms, and was delighted to find it equally favourable, if not even more so, than her own. "Even before he spoke," said Elvira, "I was prejudiced in his favour. The fervour of his exhortations, dignity of his manner, and closeness of his reasoning were very far from inducing me to alter my opinion. His fine and full-toned voice struck me particularly. But surely, Antonia, I have heard it before. It seemed perfectly familiar to my ear. Either I must have known the abbot in former times, or his voice bears a wonderful resemblance to that of some other, to whom I have often listened. There were certain tones which touched my very heart, and made me feel sensations so singular that I strive in vain to account for them. My dearest mother, it produced the same effect upon me, yet certainly neither of us ever heard his voice till we came to Madrid. I suspect that what we attribute to his voice really proceeds from his pleasant manners, which forbid our considering him as a stranger. I know not why, but I feel more at my ease while conversing with him than I usually do with people who are unknown to me. I feared not to repeat to him all my childish thoughts, and somehow I felt confident that he would hear my folly with indulgence. Oh, I was not deceived in him. He listened to me with such an air of kindness and attention. He answered me with such gentleness, such condescension. He did not call me an infant and treat me with contempt, as our cross old confessor at the castle used to do. I verily believe that if I had lived in Mercia 1,000 years, I never should have liked that fat old Father Dominic. I confess that Father Dominic had not the most pleasing manners in the world, but he was honest, friendly, and well-meaning. Ah! My dear mother, those qualities are so common. God grant, my child, that experience may not teach you to think them rare and precious. I have found them but too much so. But tell me, Antonia, why is it impossible for me to have seen the abbot before? Because since the moment when he entered the abbey, he has never been on the outside of its walls. He told me just now that from his ignorance of the streets he had some difficulty to find the Strada di San Iago, though so near the abbey. All this is possible, and still I may have seen him before he entered the abbey. In order to come out, it was rather necessary that he should first go in. Holy Virgin! As you say, that is very true. Oh, but might he not have been born in the abbey? Elvira smiled. Why, not very easily. Stay, stay. Now I recollect how it was. He was put into the abbey quite a child. The common people say that he fell from heaven, and was sent as a present to the Capuchins by the Virgin. That was very kind of her. And so he fell from heaven, Antonia. He must have had a terrible tumble. Many do not credit this, and I fancy, my dear mother, that I must number you among the unbelievers. Indeed, as our landlady told my aunt, the general idea is that his parents, being poor and unable to maintain him, left him just born at the abbey door. A late superior from pure charity had him educated in the convent, and he proved to be a model of virtue and piety and learning, and I know not what else besides. In consequence, he was first received as a brother of the order, and not long ago was chosen abbot. However, whether this account or the other is the true one, at least all agree that when the monks took him under their care, he could not speak. Therefore, you could not have heard his voice before he entered the monastery, because at that time he had no voice at all. Upon my word, Antonia, you argue very closely. Your conclusions are infallible. I did not suspect you of being so able a logician. Ah, you are mocking me, but so much the better. It delights me to see you in spirits. Besides, you seem tranquil and easy, and I hope that you will have no more convulsions. Oh, I was sure the abbot's visit would do you good. It has indeed done me good, my child. He has quieted my mind upon some points which agitated me, and I already feel the effects of his attention. My eyes grow heavy, and I think I can sleep a little. Draw the curtains, my Antonia. But if I should not wake before midnight, do not sit up with me, I charge you. Antonia promised to obey her, and having received her blessing, drew the curtains of the bed. She then seated herself in silence at her embroidery frame, and beguiled the hours with building castles in the air. Her spirits were enlivened by the evident change for the better in Elvira, and her fancy presented her with visions bright and pleasing. In these dreams, Ambrosio made no despicable figure. She thought of him with joy and gratitude, but for every idea which fell to the friar's share, at least 2 were unconsciously bestowed upon Lorenzo. Thus passed the time, till the bell in the neighbouring steeple of the Capuchin cathedral announced the hour of midnight. Antonia remembered her mother's injunctions and obeyed them, though with reluctance. She undrew the curtains with caution. Elvira was enjoying a profound and quiet slumber. Her cheek glowed with health's returning colours. A smile declared that her dreams were pleasant, and as Antonia bent over her, she fancied that she heard her name pronounced. She kissed her mother's forehead softly and retired to her chamber. There she knelt before a statue of Stantrazolia, her patroness. She recommended herself to the protection of heaven, and as had been her custom from infancy, concluded her devotions by chaunting the following stanzas. Midnight, Hymn. Now all is hushed. The solemn chime no longer swells the nightly gale. Thy awful presence, hour sublime, with spotless heart once more I hail. 'Tis now the moment still and dread, when sorcerers use their baleful power, when graves give up their buried dead to profit by the sanctioned hour, from guilt and guilty thoughts secure, to duty and devotion true, with bosom light and conscience pure, repose. Thy gentle aid I woo. Good angels, take my thanks, that still the snares of vice I view with scorn. Thanks, that tonight as free from ill I sleep as when I woke at morn. Yet may not my unconscious breast harbour some guilt to me unknown, some wish impure which unrepressed you blush to see and I to own. If such there be, in gentle dream instruct my feet to shun the snare. Bid truth upon my errors beam, and deign to make me still your care. Chase from my peaceful bed away the witching spell, a foe to rest, the nightly goblin, wanton fay, the ghost in pain and fiend unblessed. Let not the tempter in mine ear pour lessons of unhallowed joy. Let not the nightmare, wandering near my couch, the calm of sleep destroy. Let not some horrid dream affright with strange fantastic forms mine eyes, but rather bid some vision bright display the bliss of yonder skies. Show me the crystal domes of heaven, the worlds of light where angels lie. Show me the lot to mortals given, who guiltless live, who guiltless die. Then show me how a seat to gain amidst those blissful realms of air. Teach me to shun each guilty stain, and guide me to the good and fair. So every morn and night, my voice to heaven the grateful strain shall raise. In you as guardian powers rejoice, good angels, and exalt your praise. So will I strive with zealous fire each vice to shun, each fault correct, will love the lessons you inspire, and prize the virtues you protect. Then when at length by high command my body seeks the grave's repose, when death draws nigh with friendly hand my failing pilgrim eyes to close, pleased that my soul has scaped the wreck, Silas will I my life resign, and yield to God my spirit back, as pure as when it first was mine. Having finished her usual devotions, Antonia retired to bed. Sleep soon stole over her senses, and for several hours she enjoyed that calm repose which innocence alone can know, and for which many a monarch with pleasure would exchange his crown.